possibility here. Now, on page 132, unless there's a question before that, he begins to deal with these philosophical theories of the nature of sin. But any questions so far about the first couple pages that you have? Now, he has no less than 7 different philosophical theories. We have a number of collegians with us tonight who are on a spring break from the school, and it would be interesting to them just incidentally to notice that a course in theology is very definitely as scientific as any course in astronomy or chemistry would be as far as analysis and theorizing is concerned. Any notion that theology is a matter of the heart and science is a matter of the brain is a misapprehension that would be immediately corrected by a book like this on systematic theology. You know full well that this is as technical in its sphere as anything you read in economics or philosophy proper or psychology or anything like that. And that's the way it should be. This is a science too, though unlike, say, chemistry, for example, it doesn't make any difference as far as the class is concerned whether chemistry reaches your heart or not, whether you're turned on by biology or economics or not. Whereas it makes all the difference in the world whether this Bible, which has to be studied scientifically and technically, nevertheless reaches your heart and changes your heart. That's the basic difference between the class we have here and the class you'd have at the university and so on. But at the same time, the scientific aspect of it, the serious scholarship aspect of it, the necessity of a theologian doing his homework and knowing his data and so on is every bit as important, if not more so, for the theologian than it would be for the other. Remember, we talk of theology as the queen of the sciences. The queen of the sciences as a science. It's the top of the peak. It's the ultimate form of knowledge. But unlike the other forms of knowledge, your eternal life doesn't depend on whether it clicks with you or not, or whether it registers with you, whereas in this particular case, you're not just learning something, you are learning a way of everlasting life or damnation if you reject it. That's how serious it is. You don't hear a professor of science talking the possibility of being damned because you don't accept a certain view of astronomy or arithmetic or something like that. But you'll be damned if you don't accept what the Bible says is the Word of God. That's the kind of seriousness you have in a class like that you don't have in an ordinary science class. But the commonality is the necessity of sound argument. That's the reason we have as much dialogue as we have time for. But so first of all, the philosophical theory of the nature of sin he discusses for some 15 pages and introduces us to a few of them. I'll just mention this first one is very, very common in other religions, Parsi religion, Eastern religion especially. We call it dualism, and you can see why it has appealed to people. There is an ineradicable evil in human life. Everybody admits that. This world is not what it ought to be. It's not only wrath of God revealed from heaven, there's not only troubled consciences within, but just nobody is Pollyannish about this world as a whole. There is something wrong with it, and so you can see how it's appealed to some thinkers, and mostly in the East, and I think it's not been in the West so much, mostly because of the influence of Christianity, but left to themselves, you could see how they could very well feel there was a principle of light and a principle of darkness, that's built into the very nature of things, and there's an everlasting struggle, because neither one of these ultimate principles can dominate the other or control the other. That's what we call dualism. That there are an evil principle which is as ultimate as the principle of righteousness. Ahura Mazda or Ahriman are the different words. And sometimes Christians think of it as God and Satan, but you realize God and Satan did not compare to Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. The principle of light and darkness are eternal and equally ultimate principles, locked in everlasting combat. Whereas in the case of Christianity, there's only one God. And Satan is just a fallen creature of his, totally under his power, able to do nothing in the way of evil that God himself does not permit. So though you do have an evil principle in Christianity, it is not ultimate. And we'll find the philosophers and the theologians wrestling with what that actually is. But what Hodge does here, we might look at this first section here just to get his methodology, if you haven't already noticed it, on his first theory I've just described. And after he gives the theory in the paragraph, and I've given it in my own words, then he gives his critique. And here he says, this theory obviously is, one, inconsistent with theism. That is, you can't believe there are two ultimate principles and believe there's one God. If there's only one God, then he has to be absolutely ultimate. And if there are two principles, then the notion that there's only one God, hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God, that's wrong. That's false. And by the same token, if that's true, any notion of ultimate combat goes by the board. And he mentions other objections as well, and I don't think I need to develop that. The same procedure he follows with the second one, the limitation of being. But any question on the first couple which he mentions here before he comes to Leibniz's theory of privation on page 134? Leibniz was a great 18th century philosopher, and he points, yes, Chris, but I may say that, he points out about Leibniz that Leibniz is unlike the Eastern thinkers who are anti-theistic and so on. He was a Christian philosopher of the first magnitude and was trying to spin out a philosophical explanation compatible with the Christian revelation. Yes, Chris? Yeah, the way he's developing it there. See, he refers to Augustine. He touches Augustine lightly because, philosophically speaking, Augustine has something like it. But the real development of it as an ultimate principle there, it's Spinozistic. Spinoza was a Jew, you remember, who was put out of the synagogue in Amsterdam because of his heresy. I mean, he was seen as contrary to Jewish theism. He was a pantheist in their thinking, and as such, he had no more right in a synagogue than a pantheist would have in a Christian church, and so on. But he feels here that though Augustine sounds a little like that at certain points when he's speaking philosophically, that the real Augustine, when he stands up, you see it's really the genuine Christian view. And this type of thing that's bad and developed as an anti-Christian system is associated with Spinoza rather than with Augustine. But he'll have a serious discussion of Augustine before, I mean, we'll have to take some time to look at it. At the bottom of page 135, he mentions this, that with Augustine, defect is the absence of a moral good which the creature should possess. With Leibniz, negation is the necessary limitation of the powers of the creature. That's a very fine sentence, I think, describing the essential difference between these two Christian philosophers, mind you. Now, we're leaving Spinoza behind. Spinoza's a real pantheist and had an ultimate principle of evil as well as good and so on, but they were all one. But now when you deal with Augustine and you deal with Wilhelm Leibniz, you're dealing with two philosophers, Christian philosophers, of the first magnitude. Like college students, for example, if they've taken any kind of a survey of philosophy, they've encountered the name of Leibniz, certainly, and quite possibly Augustine. If they haven't encountered Augustine in the philosophy course, it's because the man teacher or woman teaching the course has thought of Augustine as a theologian. But in Weber Perry's History of Philosophy, for example, in the History of Philosophy, Augustine has no less than 10 pages. He's recognized as a philosopher in his own right as well, and most people who get beyond the fact that the man is probably the most important Christian theologian since the Apostle Paul, and just look at him on his own merits. He was a rhetorician of the first order, even quite a developer of musical theory. And his, of course, City of God is one massive historical survey. But he was a philosopher also in his own right, and he deserves 10 pages in any general survey of the history of thought. But Leibniz, you wouldn't know he was a Christian unless I told you. Anybody who knows anything at all knows Augustine's a Christian. You have to know a little bit more about, I mean, if you know anything about philosophy, you know Leibniz. And but you wouldn't necessarily know he's a Christian. But he's a Christian, just as truly, and a Protestant Christian, and Augustine was a Protestant Christian long before Protestantism officially came along. But the difference that Hodge recognizes between these two gigantic Christian philosophers is who resemble each other in a very important point in their attempt to account for evil or sin. But this is the difference that Hodge very deftly points out. With Augustine, defect Defect is the cause of sin. It's a causa deficiens. It is not a positive force in Augustine or in Leibniz. But the difference, he says, is this. Defect in Augustine is the absence of a moral good which the creature should possess. This just doesn't belong to his finitude. This belongs to something other than that. It's not a part of his nature. Whereas in Leibniz, negation or defect is the necessary limitation of the powers of the creature. You see, what Leibniz is doing is identifying evil or sin with finitude. And Augustine, while he's very definitely insisting that sin could only come about through finite being, it nevertheless is abnormal. It's an aberration. It's what ought not to be. It has to be dealt with. It can't be philosophically explained as if it were a part of our nature. Now, as you hear me say this, you'd say, well, how in the world could a Christian philosopher such as Leibniz think it could? Well, I think the answer is, on that point, Leibniz was a Christian, but he wasn't as orthodox as Augustine. He tried to preserve a general Protestant stance, but he was very much of an ecumenist as far as his 18th century activities were concerned. And people of that persuasion sometimes tend to shade the edges to smooth it out to make union easier, and they're not as careful about a meticulous orthodoxy. I think that's part of the reason. Leibniz was careless enough that he almost fell into the sin of an ultimate dualism. That is, God as creature is as creator is by definition good. The creature, precisely because he's not God, precisely because he's not infinite, is therefore by nature defective. And you're going to see, of course, you can almost sense it if you've never even read Leibniz. If that's the case, then sin is not really very sinful. It's actually a part of the divine creation. And it's going to end up as a basically good thing. And that's actually the way it does. When he talks about this being the best possible world and so on, he has that idea in mind. And I think what Hodge is meaning by this cryptic sentence here is that though he doesn't agree with Augustine in this view of sin as merely defect, any more than he agrees with Leibniz. He is saying Augustine, in spite of he had a tiger by the tail, but he threw the tiger. But in the case of Leibniz, the tiger threw Leibniz. This faulty idea didn't quite dominate Augustine, according to Hodge, but it did pull Leibniz out of a real Christian orbit into what amounts to a virtual justification of sin or evil. It's just, after all, it's no sin to be created. Finitude can't be a sin. Or if finitude is a sin, then of course God's the author of evil and all the rest of it goes with it by the board, as you can see. I think I'll let it go at that. Any comments that you want to raise? Anything else about that view? The fourth one on sin as necessary antagonism is a development of that further that I won't take time for, except I think I'll resist the temptation to comment on this point, but there, on page 138, just before he gets to Schleiermacher, he has a statement about this view that I don't think is fair to the view. I don't mean that Hodge intends to twist it or distort it, but I do think he's not doing justice to it. But unless somebody has a special interest in it, I won't take the time for it this evening because we have so much on our agenda here. But any question before we look at 5? Yes, please, Randy.
Has anybody ever, I know it's a great mystery where it came from, but has anybody ever come up with a good Christian view of where evil did come from? I mean, obviously, Augustine goes to the point of saying that it's a defect that the creature was not created perfect as God was created. But as I remember when I read him, he never did really come out and say where evil did came from. He just left it as a mysterious mystery that he couldn't solve, but he knew that God was good. God could not create evil. He did know the creature was a creature and that there was a defect in him, but he didn't ever ascribe it to God. Leipzig seems
No, he was trying to avoid that.
He was trying to avoid that, but Leipzig seems to address the point of evil, saying that it is a limitation in the creature. The negation is the nature of his being, which addresses what would appear to be the obvious, but people feel, or Hodge feels that he's giving away the store when he addresses it that way. So has anybody really addressed that question?
Well, see, in a certain sense there, Randy, toward the end you were running him in with Leibniz, you see, as making it as almost integral to finitude. Now, there's something in Augustine which moves in that direction, but he very definitely held back from it and insisted that the finite didn't have to be sinful, and did blame man for it. But the way in which he accounted for Adam's falling away was the fact that he fell away from goodness. It didn't need a positive principle of evil in him, traceable to his finitude or anything else. It's just the fact that God alone is good and immutably good, and unless a person stays in union with him, he will fall away. It doesn't need a positive cause for evil. All he needs to be is devoid of the divine influence. And according to Augustine, man did indeed fall away from God. Not necessarily, as he would necessarily do it in the Leibnizian type of view, you see. Not necessarily. But what he's trying to say is, because he's trying to account for evil without getting God's hands dirty in this matter, it was not God's doing. God didn't push man into sin. God didn't plant a principle of evil in him. God didn't make him necessarily evil because he was finite. But God did make it possible for him to fall away. Now that's where your real problem comes in. Why would he fall away? Augustine doesn't have any more satisfactory answer on that than anybody else does, but he does try to say, though, that the sin comes from the falling away from God and doesn't require anything other than that to actually explain it.
So the real difference is that the finitude is not bad.
That's right.
Finitude is not bad.
And don't let me give the impression that Leibniz will quite say in so many words finitude is bad, but he will say that finitude does indeed belong to, it's inevitably involved in something like this. He would say the inevitably involved, whereas a man like Augustine would not say it's inevitable. It's not inevitable. It could be avoided. And if you ever read certain sections of that Whitney Oates's two-volume collection that you have, Randy, you'll remember that according to Augustine, what was necessary here was for Adam to call upon this adiutorium, this aid that would keep him steady in his holiness in which he was created. He didn't do so. And he didn't bring the divine power to sustain him. Now, a number of theologians have said the same thing. But nevertheless, the problem that you're asking, why didn't he do it, see? If that was necessary, why didn't he do it? Well, Augustine can't tell you that either. But he will say it was because he didn't do it. Now, he could have done it. He should have done it. He's damned because he didn't do it, and he brought the whole world into ruin because he didn't do it. But nevertheless, it's not because of his finitude that he fell. It's because in his finitude, he fancied he could go it alone, that he could then dispense without the divine aid that he should have called upon, and so on. None of that's in Leibniz, you see. Leibniz is much more purely speculative and philosophical. If there's no other question on this, let's take a look at Schleiermacher's view. We call him the father of liberalism, and while he's a 19th century theologian, and I keep reminding you, of course, this is a 19th century book we're looking at, so Schleiermacher was just being felt with great power. He died in 1834, and his power grew after his death even more. His great book on Christliche Glaube wasn't published till 1820. As they say, it always in those days took 20 or 30 years to cross the Atlantic before these ideas would hit America. And though Hodge himself had studied in Germany and was close to a great Lutheran defender of that time and knew Schleiermacher from Germany, the impact of Schleiermacher, who was a German Lutheran theologian, Reformed theologian, was just being felt in this country powerfully in the middle of last century. This particular edition of Hodge we're reading is 1870. And Hodge is discussing something that's as up to date a century ago as, say, process theology would be today. This would be the kind of problem Christian philosophers are wrestling with today. This is the kind of problem they were wrestling with in earnest a century ago. And though the Schleiermacher is still being constantly revived. Young Niebuhr at Harvard makes a specialty of him as a professor at the University of Chicago, who also thinks he's the last word to this day. Garish and others. So Schleiermacher, though his power was much greater in last century, when Hodge, that's the reason Hodge gives so much space to him here, he still is far from being obsolete. Some of you young people especially have to remember that type of thing. Unless it happened yesterday, it's not very up to date and so on. I have to remind you the things that happened a century ago can be very much up to date, and that's the case with Schleiermacher. But there is a difference when a man's first powerful impact on a culture is felt and when it does later on, just as we were saying last week. This was written 10 years after The Origin of Species. Evolution is still with us and the issue is still with us, but when Darwinism really came with power in these United States, Hodge was reaching the end of his career, and it was very significant. What he had to say about it was very significant about this, and this is a very serious critique of a man like Schleiermacher, who was being accepted as a valid interpreter of the Christian religion. If you read this description here, you can see why Hodge says about him, the man's a pure pantheist. He's just using Christian terminology, and people ought to be aware of the difference between Christian doctrine and mere Christian terminology. But I get an argument from Niebuhr at Harvard on that, or Garish from Chicago on that even today. But neither Niebuhr at Harvard nor Garish at Chicago is any standard of orthodoxy today, any more than Schleiermacher was in the 19th century. But it does show when people like this have power in institutions like that their influence is far from over. But on his criticism, very bottom of page 139, he gives a running description of Schleiermacher's pattern of thought. But his very first criticism at the bottom of page 139, it precludes or rules out the idea of a personal God. He talks about God all the time, talks about Christ all the time, and if you read him non-discriminatingly, you think he's a Christian theologian, but if you read discriminatingly, you realize he doesn't have a personal God at all. I told you when I did my doctoral work at Harvard back in the 40s, there were at least 3 professors in the divinity school who didn't believe in a personal God. They talk about God all the time, but they'd make it they weren't trying to fool anybody. It was perfectly plain. They didn't believe in a personal deity. They still used the term. You have to watch that type of thing. People aren't like those people in Jude trying deliberately to sneak in and deceive. These people don't have anything to lose. They're liberal professors. Everybody knows it. They're not going to be tried for heresy. They don't have to dissimulate or anything like that. But they nevertheless use the same language. And if you weren't perceptive about it, you would actually suppose they're talking about the Christian religion because they use Christian terms. They talk about Christ, and they'll talk about his divinity, and they'll talk about God, and you'll think you're talking about a personal deity. But when you read the description, you realize this isn't a personal deity at all. This is a speculative being. Same thing is true of the late Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich had no belief in a personal deity that would meet any ordinary definition of the term personal. God was beyond definition in his type of thinking, yet he talked about him all the time, and many people felt he was the most influential Christian philosopher of his own time. Now, if you measure his Christianity with any form of historic Christianity, you'd have to say, this man no Christian at all. This isn't a Christian theology that you're given. Your students must be aware of this type of thing, but those of you who've been out of school for a while maybe be reminded of it. But I hate to skip over this sort of thing so rapidly, but and I don't know whether you've done your homework or read it or not, but if you have any questions, all right. Otherwise, I'll have to let it go at that brief point. I notice some people perspiring. I guess you're doing everything you can to be comfortable, huh? Again, I'm insensitive to this thing. I feel sorry for you people sitting there and having to listen for 2 hours and so on, but my compassion's all I can give you. I can't relieve it or anything like that. I can't even hook myself up. What's that? Oh, there you are, Chris. Can you do that? That's good. Yeah, don't hesitate to tell me. You see, I don't know nothing from nothing. You just have to tell me to tell somebody, and somebody will be useful around here. This next view that he considers is the sensuous view, and really it's what we call the Greek view, the contrast between the spirit and the body, and the supposition that the body is somehow or other evil, and the soul is somehow or other good. And Hodge in this material shows, as in the middle of page 143, for example, item number 6, this theory is opposed to the doctrine of the Bible. The Scriptures do indeed refer a large class of sins to the sensual nature of man, and they represent the flesh or sarx as the seat of sin and the source of all of its manifestations in our present state. They moreover use the word sarkikos, carnal, as synonymous with corrupt or sinful. But in spite of all of that, they don't identify the body with sin. The body is not evil, and the spirit good, which was the Greek idea. Soul or spirit good. I remind you once again that Hodge was not only a systematic theologian, but he was a very fine biblical exegete. Excuse me just a second, Rich. And he's very familiar, written commentaries, very able commentaries on many of the books of the Bible, including the book of Romans, where Paul goes into this very minute discussion of the body and spirit in the biblical sense of the word, in Romans 7 especially, and so on. And he points out that the Bible does indicate very clearly that much of our sin comes from our indulgence of the body and their bodily sins, but it makes it clear at the same time that the body as such is not sinful, and bodily activities as such are not sinful. But you can, because of your indulgence of the body, actually sin, but it has to be ultimate. This is one thing Hodge doesn't make quite as clear as he could here. It's not only that the body is not evil and the soul is not good. As creatures of God, both are good. But they can be perverted. But the source of corruption is never the body. It's always the soul. The soul is what leads the body to put the hand in the cookie jar. It's not I didn't do it, my hand did it. You know, that type of nonsense that the child is supposed to have said, putting the blame on his hand for the taking. Of course, the hand took the cookie. That's perfectly true. But you know what led that hand to take the cookie, and the hand was an utterly innocent instrument. It was that bad little boy who saw fit to take the cookie that he was not supposed to take. But this is the only place where sin really locates, according to the Bible. What Hodge does point out is that the Bible makes it perfectly clear, not only that the soul can be evil, as when the body be good, but the soul, when it sins, the sins of the soul, like pride, are far more serious in the biblical estimation than the sins of the body, such as fornication or any other bodily corruption. They're sins and damning, but pride and arrogance and self-righteousness and so on are even more terrible. And any idea that just because these are bodily aberrations and so on, that they're the only kind of sin is not the case. But Rich...
I'm going to jump ahead, but it's somewhat related to this. Where did the idea that somehow original sin came from that we were reproduced by sexual intercourse, and sexual intercourse is bad, therefore original sin is bad, and the reason why Christ was righteous was because he was not born that way?
Well, the idea comes from the speculation about Genesis, not that sexual intercourse was sinful, but that in the case of Adam and Eve it was sinful. They were presumed to have been forbidden that relationship. There's no proof of that, and the Bible, of course, never says that intercourse between legitimately married persons is at all sinful. As a matter of fact, it's a duty, and it should be in the Lord, and so on. But see, we know from the biblical narrative that Adam and Eve were forbidden to participate in this particular food. Now, what it was, see, that's driven the theologians of the ages up there. What in the world was there about that tree that was forbidden that made it fatal once a person participated? The ultimate thing is that God said no. And the very fact that it was an act of disobedience, and the fact that our original parents could have raised the question, why did God forbid this particular tree? And not get any answer to it. It's beside the point. He did. That's what matters. He did. But again, that might have been the whole essence of it. The very fact he didn't give any reason. See? He just said, don't eat of this tree. That's enough. If God said, don't do it, don't do it. Now, God usually, I remember when a little girl was growing up, and I said, Rachel, when I tell you don't go off the porch, don't go off the porch. Don't make me have to explain I see a snake down there at the bottom of the step, you see, or something like that. If Dad said, don't go off the porch, first of all, don't go off the porch. Now, she knew very well I'd always explain if I had time. But if she was in the way of an oncoming truck, I didn't want to stand and reason with her as to why she ought to step out of the way, you see, and so on. I wanted her to learn in the first place she ought to obey her mother and her father. They'll be giving these orders if they give them, especially under an emergency, for the child's good and so on. And don't make us explain every time and so on, but at the same time we will when we have opportunity. We don't want to sound arrogant or arbitrary or anything like that. So it could well be that. But of course you could see it could also be the pride that the Satan pointed out, you know, about this particular tree, and the idea that God had a hidden agenda there. He knew that if you ate of that tree, you'd be just like him, you see, and so on. Maybe it was that arrogance, you see, to be like God. And so, but you can start speculating, because the Bible doesn't say. The Bible just simply says, you tend the garden, name the animals, it gave him a job to do, and he told him something not to do, and so on. And of course, because they were originally naked, and because they were alone in the world, and because it's a natural thing for a man and a woman, especially the two in the whole universe, to cohabit and so on, and naturally somebody's going to speculate with the fact that they were forbidden to have sexual relationships, and they're having sexual relationships under those circumstances. It's one speculation among a half a dozen. But it's had a wide appeal for obvious reasons. Sexual sin is a very powerful one, even now. Many people go to hell for that particular reason, and that the whole world could have fallen into sin because of a violation of that commandment is an easy thing to speculate. But I'd maintain there's no way by which you can prove what it was that was prohibited about that. One thing we know is that that tree was prohibited.
I guess I didn't take the question correctly. I was more like kind of a variation on immediate imputation. The means of immediate imputation is because of the way we're born. I've heard this before, and I was just curious where it came from, is that the way the imputation works in the immediate sense was via sexual intercourse.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, that I gave you a free lecture for 10 minutes there. I'm glad you made this public, because on the way home my wife would say, you know, when Rich asked you that question, you took 10 minutes not to answer it, and so on. And so on. But now that I know what it is you have in mind and so on, I'll address the question you had in your mind. Previously, I was only talking to the question that came out of your mouth, and I'll tell you now it's in your mind, and so on. This, incidentally, takes us to the end of the book, where he talks about immediate and immediate imputation, which is the order of the day. You know, we don't have to follow the pages as they're here, and so on, and especially in the latter part where we're not likely to get anyway. But since Rich is raising the question about immediate and immediate imputation, let's take a look at that. Now, we are talking about Adam's fall in man, and the way in which the guilt of that fall is communicated to us, so that we are born dead in trespasses and sins. That's a part of the Orthodox doctrine, as you know, long before you read Charles Hodge, but you certainly know it more fully now from having read Hodge. Now, the view that Rich is talking about here is the idea that the way the guilt and sin of Adam is communicated is through procreation. Children are born from Adam and Eve, and they, because their parents were fallen, they too inherit right in the bloodstream, as it were, in the very genes. They inherit their parents' characteristic, including their fallenness. And because they are born fallen, by virtue of descending from fallen persons, especially the first parents and so on, they are then damned, so that the transmission of the sin from the parent to the child, from the original parent to all of us children, and subsequently from all of us subsequent parents to our children, and so on, is mediated. The guilt of Adam's transgression is mediated to us through our actual pollution. See, first comes the pollution through our parents, and because we are born as polluted children, we are guilty. We really are polluted, and we are therefore guilty. But this is called immediate imputation, because the pollution is the medium by means of which we become guilty of original sin. Now, the immediate view, by contrast, is this, that because we were represented by the first man, and because his act was on our behalf, what he did, we were guilty of, and consequently immediately guilty. And because we're in Adam, represented in Adam, when we are born, we are immediately guilty, because we sinned in Adam. And that immediate guilt is what leads to our pollution. So in this case, it's first the guilt, and then the pollution that follows. The guilt is immediate because of our relationship to Adam. And according to this, it is mediated or not immediate because the pollution which we inherit through the sexual intercourse, through the procreation of the human race and so on, is that. But there's nothing sinful in the in actual sexual relationships in the marriage bond, even though this question came up to Augustine more than once in his life, that if we in ordinary marital cohabitation produce children that are going to be born dead in trespasses and sins, is it not a sin for us to have even legitimate marital conjugal relations? And Augustine would say, of course not. God has ordained that as the proper way. It's perfectly true that because we're a fallen race, the children are born. They are born. He took the immediate view. The Reformed view generally is the immediate view, but that results from it. But the relationship is legitimate, and there's a duty to marry and a duty to have children and an irresponsibility on the part of the parents for the children being visited with sin. It isn't because of their, ultimately it's because of the Adamic fall that they did that. But sexual relationships in marriage remain intact and good and wholesome and beautiful. Sinful outside of the marital relationship, but not only acceptable, but downright virtuous in the legitimate marital relationship.
Is this how Rome came up with the Immaculate Conception of Mary?
It's not unrelated to that. That is the Immaculate, the virgin birth of Christ is usually the reference to Christ's birth. The Immaculate Conception is usually a reference to Mary's birth, you see. The idea that Mary, if she was the mother of Jesus and a fallen person herself, would necessarily communicate her corruption. Goes back to Rich's question. In the very process, even though there was no male involved in the matter, nevertheless, she was truly human and she was a fallen person. And if she were a fallen person, even though Christ was miraculously born, nevertheless, her corruption, even in the virgin birth, would still be passed on to Jesus Christ. So that's what led Rome to speculate that she must be free of sin. And the doctrine of the sinlessness of Mary is a part of Roman dogma to this day. And in that sense, it's connected with it. You realize, though, where that would lead. Of course, if Mary has to be immaculately conceived to prevent Christ from being corrupted, then her mother has to have been that way to prevent her from being corrupted, and so on. It would have to go back there. It's a theological speculation that grows out of Roman thinking. But it does grow out of this particular connection. It's an effort to keep Christ from being contaminated by the transmission of sin. Now, what is a Protestant answer to that? How is Christ kept free from the contamination of Mary? See, we reject the dogma of the sinlessness of Mary. And with virgin birth, of course, is standard doctrine. But the Immaculate Conception of Mary is rejected out of hand as a non-biblical conception. Even Thomas Aquinas objected to it on the ground that Christ is the Savior of the world. And if Mary was not a sinner, she wouldn't even be saved by Jesus Christ and so on. But how do we avoid that? Well, our avoiding is by the fact that it was a miraculous birth. It wasn't only that Jesus Christ was born of a woman only, but also by the miracle of divine grace, he was prevented from receiving her corruption. It's a double miracle there, in other words. The miracle of a virgin birth without a male, but also the miracle of a person born of a sinful virgin, Mary, without being corrupted with her sin, was itself a miracle as well, as we would say. And Rome postulates all these other miracles, you see, would have to go right back to Eve herself if they were going to carry it through consistently. Is there enough on that before we come to the seventh and last view of theory of sin is selfishness? This one deserves more time than we can give it to. A very common view that all sin comes ultimately from selfishness. Now, of course, is it pride, as we were talking before? Is it illicit sexual relationship? Is it envy? Is it a desire to be divine or something like that? We don't know, but at any rate, it's a desire to satisfy oneself as over against the divine commandment. You must not eat of this particular tree, says God. If you do eat of that, it'll be because of something in you that leads you to desire what God has forbidden and actually to countermand his authority. So you can see why there have been a good many theologians who said the ultimate form of sin is selfishness. Hodge is very careful to distinguish between that and self-love. Self-love is an instinct and it's natural and it's not sinful. selfishness is, as he would say, an undue concern for self. As Bishop Butler would say, it's an other disregarding concern for self. It's not, for me to be concerned with my own well-being is a duty. It's not a sin. But for me to do it at your expense is a sin. For me to see to it that Gerstner gets along no matter what happens to you or anybody else here, that's a sin. As a matter of fact, that would actually be destructive of my self-love, because if I don't have any concern for you, obviously I'm violating God's command. It's going to be hard on me, as a matter of fact. So what I have to watch there is that I don't have a concern for you in the last analysis only because I have a concern for me. The only reason I'm considerate of you is because if I'm not, it's going to hurt John Gerstner, you see. I've got to watch that particular subtlety. It's not enough just to be unselfish. You've got to be unselfish because of a genuine concern for other people. And that can't be just a subtle form of selfishness. Whereas I try to do good to you, not because I care at all about you, but because I do care about me. And I know from God, I'm to love one another, I'm to love my enemies, I'm to do good, I'm to go the second mile, etc., 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 if I want to lay up treasures in heaven. So the only reason I try to teach you anything or do anything good for you is because I want to have as much treasure in heaven as possible. You know full well I don't have any real love for you in a case like that. And I have to say to myself, Gerstner, you're outwitting yourself. You think you're being smart now by being good to these people for the interests of John Gerstner. Well, you ought to be smart enough to realize that's not going to do John Gerstner any good at all, because you don't have any real concern for them. I mean, the searcher of hearts knows that. They may not know it, but he who searches the hearts will know it. So, but at any rate, his self-love is an instinct and a proper thing. But when a person has a concern for himself that disregards other people or uses other people as a means rather than an end and so on, that is the ultimate form of sin. Now, Hodge has very little patience with this, and he gives a running critique of it, but I think I'll have to let it go unless you have a question or two about it. I think a good deal more could be said about this particular doctrine here, and I could deal with some of his criticism, but because of time, I think I'll not unless you have some questions about any of these 7 views he gives that are philosophical attempts to explain the doctrine. Before we take our break here, you might notice on page 149, he goes to the third topic, the doctrine of the early church, and moves into a discussion of Pelagian theory on 152, which today we would call the liberal view of, and then he gives his arguments against that liberal view on page 155, and that leads him to what we want to take up when we come back, the Augustinian doctrine on page 157. He doesn't bother with any of the history here, but you remember what triggered this famous historic debate between the British monk named Pelagius, and the Bishop of Hippo, Aurelius Augustinus, was the fact that when this monk was visiting in Rome, he heard this statement attributed correctly to Augustine, that in his Confessions, Augustine says, "Command what thou wilt and give what thou commandest." Or the other way around, give what thou commandest and command what thou wilt. And that cut Pelagius to the quick. The idea that he had to be enabled by grace to do good. Give what thou commandest. That enraged Pelagius. Pelagius felt he had it within his own power to do what was good. And the very fact that he had a duty to do what's good implied, he felt, the idea that without any grace, he was able of himself to do what is good. So he was profoundly, indignantly displeased with Augustine for that particular doctrine, and it began a historic debate that has had an impact to this day. Pelagius is still being translated and edited. Augustine, of course, has more books in the Library of Congress than any religious figure in the Christian history outside the Bible, and so on. But this debate is quite central. But see, Augustine, believing in original sin, as we will notice when we come back from the break here, Augustine is recognizing that God's commandments are perfect, and he doesn't want God to step down his commandments at all. He knows it's foolish, and he knows that it's right if God commands it and so on, but at the same time, he wants enablement. I was writing to somebody recently who was having a problem there, and I I was saying that this is a divine trick that God plays on us, a very beneficent trick. He makes the commandments so difficult that we can't possibly keep them. And we are driven to him. It's a strategy. It's a divine strategy. It's a way of keeping us very, very close to Jesus Christ. To know that if we stray from his side at all, we're going to fall into sin. His commandments are nothing less than perfect. Everybody in this new room knows full well. If you can't step them down, as Arminianism does, that's the thrust of Arminianism. We can't take time for that right now. But if you step those commandments down to the point where I can cope with them, then manifestly I am not dependent on divine enablement and divine grace. But if the commandments are perfect, and Augustine insisted that they were, don't let up, Lord. Command what thou wilt, but give what thou commandest. But that was an outrage to the self-respecting liberal monk named Pelagius, and it began a historic controversy. Today we would say it's going on still. It's the difference between liberalism and basic evangelicalism, core evangelicalism or Augustinianism or Calvinism, whatever term you choose to use there. But any question before we take our break? And as I say, when we come back, we'll look at Augustine more closely. If not, see you in 10 minutes. Huh? Then Tish has all sorts of luxuries for you out there in the car if you're able to survive that long.
When Hodge refers to President Edwards, is that Jonathan Edwards?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you mean the latter part there?
Yeah.
His critique, yes.
Okay, I just...
Theory of identity. That's Jonathan, all right. Yes, sir.
John, this is from this morning, okay?
Okay,
This
yeah,
morning.
right.
You said that the italics were quotes from the Bible.
Allusions to them
Yes.
anyway, yes.
This one bothered me when I was reading it after I got home.
Yeah, that's James, of course.
Yes?
Yeah.
Now, can you help me that says not by faith only?
Yeah.
That's too difficult to...
Now, it is the same word, but I think you can see in the context, if you look at it in James 2 there, and I think you'll see that he's talking about Abraham. He's talking about Abraham's offer of his son Isaac, and so on. He's contrasting a mere faith that the devils have, who even tremble, and so on, and a man who says to a person who's hungry and naked, God bless you, and feed you, and clothe you, but doesn't do anything to alleviate it. He contrasts that with real faith expressed in action, and gives Abraham as a classic illustration. And in that context, he makes this statement here that we're justified by works. And what he's meaning there is that we're vindicated by works. The faith which you have that doesn't express itself in action is not genuine. If it's okay.
I got you.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that right.
Yes, Ken.
Is that what this is? Is that what this statement is here?
Give without, okay, yeah, that's the famous statement in the Latin itself, yeah. Give,
Okay, say it again.
that is, give
Okay.
what you command and command what you give.
Okay.
That's what you will. Right.
Two questions.
Surely.
You mentioned different levels of sin. Could you illuminate on that? Sin of the soul and sin of the body.
Yeah. I was saying, see, Christ says it'll be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for you, Chorazin and Bethsaida, those places. Sodom and Gomorrah were perverse, and so on. They're in hell, undoubtedly. But these people were rejecting the light of Jesus Christ, and in their own arrogance.
Okay, so we're talking a little like apostate. They actually heard the truth like we were.
Well, they both apostate. The Chorazin and Bethsaida apostate, so were the Sodomites. But the Sodomites were basically sexual perverts, you see, and damned as such. They nevertheless sexual perversion, horrible as it is.
Had they heard the truth, then were they a part of the truth, and then...
Yeah, they held the truth in unrighteousness, just as Paul says in Romans 1:18, about the world in general, they hold the truth in unrighteousness. These people held, see, that was even natural truth of nature, but these people held the truth of Jesus Christ incarnate in unrighteousness. They were rejecting him. They were planning to execute him, and ultimately did, and they were outraged by his very doctrine, you see, and even though they'd look down their noses at homosexuals and perverts and so on, and wouldn't pull their skirts about them and so on, Christ is saying your sin is far, far greater than theirs, and it'd be more tolerable for publicans and harlots in the day of judgment than for you, for Sodom and Gomorrah, than for Chorazin and Bethsaida.
Next comment I have in my conversations with